Good afternoon again, esteemed participants, colleagues, and friends. I'd like to thank you all for your participation in our side event. During the NPT last year, the SGI convened a side event which title was Avoiding Nuclear War, What Short-Term Steps Can Be Taken, where we also discussed no first use policy. Today's event aims to continue that dialogue, focusing on the topic of no first use within the NPT framework. Perhaps the exact meaning and the practical application of the term of no first use might be slightly different for some of us here in this room. However, the goal of this session is to explore how no first use can further disarm from three distinct angles. First one is to discuss how nuclear risk reduction can be achieved through no first use policies. Second is to discuss how no first use policy can be used as a confidence building measures. And last one is to examine how NPT state parties can contribute to advance the nuclear disarmament commitment within NPT through furthering the no first use initiatives.
I'm glad to be here, and I think we all have come here with the same aim. We want to prohibit nuclear weapons in the end. I come from something that you didn't mention, is that I come from the south of Austria. I come from Carinthia, a lovely part of Austria bordering Italy and Slovenia, and it is only a 2 hours drive and you are at the Italian shores of the Adriatic Sea. At the same distance there is Aviano, the nuclear outfitted NATO airbase. In case of an accident or an attack on Aviano, my home region would suffer severe fallout and become uninhabitable. A very impressive Kazakh film on Semipalatinsk shows sometimes it is just a question where the wind blows. And we in Carinthia get the wind and the weather from the south. We all know about these threats, and there are many attempts to reduce, to ban, to prohibit, to eliminate nuclear weapons, or even ban the testing. But at the same time, we experience an ongoing nuclear arms race. Countries are modernizing their arsenals, boosting their constructions of these lethal weapons, although there is a lot of research on the dreadful humanitarian consequences of nuclear detonations and on the risk of human and technical errors or accidents. The experts even come to the conclusion that the consequences of a nuclear conflict are much graver than estimated. The atomic scientists call it a time of unprecedented danger. There are only 19 seconds left to midnight. They moved, as you know, the hands of the doomsday clock forward because of increased nuclear danger, which at the same time undermines the global efforts to combat climate change, the second big threat. In our time of, unfortunately, mistrust and aggression, it is difficult to find ways of nuclear disarmament. What could be done easily, unilaterally and collectively without further institution or other mechanism is to give the guarantee of a non-first use policy, a guarantee urgently needed, especially as many of the treaties, mutual assurances and technical mechanisms that aim towards nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament have eroded or not progressed in the last years. Nuclear states have to agree on policies never to use weapons first. But, ladies and gentlemen, speaking about no first use policies doesn't mean that a retaliatory use, a second use, is accepted. No first use policies are seen as important steps towards the elimination of those terrible and extremely expensive weapons. No first use policies are also important steps towards nuclear disarmament as they reduce the role of nuclear weapons in the security doctrines. It is no surprise, therefore, that the nuclear armed states like China and India, which do have no first use policies, are very supportive of the proposal for the complete elimination of nuclear weapons. When the leaders of the G20, the group of G20, met in Bali in November last year, they proclaimed in their statement, which was included in the Bali Declaration, the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons is inadmissible. A very strong statement. However, this strong statement was not reaffirmed and no new measures or steps to reduce nuclear threats have been announced at the G7 meeting in Hiroshima. In fact, the G7 statement walks back significantly. What you can see is the disconnect, is the gap between the policy of nuclear deterrence and what the majority of non-nuclear states wants, categorically condemn nuclear weapons. But there is still a chance and hope that the Bali statement is reaffirmed in the NPT process at the UN General Assembly and at the G20 summit in India. To make progress, we have to engage with nuclear powers. We have to talk. We have to have diplomacy being back again. The most important issue now is to reduce the chance of nuclear weapons being used for our common collective safety. Therefore, no first use policy should be implemented by all nuclear armed and allied states. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm talking on PNND parliamentarians for trying to eliminate nuclear weapons. And laws are made by parliamentarians. That is why parliamentarians play an important role, for example, when it comes to the budget. They decide on the budget for foreign policy, diplomacy, non-proliferation and disarmament, or even on more money for weapons of mass destruction. They decide on national policy development, and they are the direct link to civil society. Civil society and parliamentarians are interlinked like communicating vessels. They both influence each other. Parliamentarians can put pressure on the governments, and civil society can support them. Civil society can also put pressure on the parliamentarians, of course. And parliamentarians can inform their constituencies and the media, thus again influencing public perception and political priorities. Parliamentarians are very active, advancing no first use policies in national legislatives and interparliamentary bodies, such as the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly or the IPU through the leadership of PNND members. I myself was in Parliament, and I was member of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, and together with PNND we really tried to get in a lot of paragraphs and having the discussion going on. PNND co-president Senator Markey leads these efforts in the US Congress, and PNND members have been able to give the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly to adopt paragraphs on nuclear risk reduction, no first use, and comprehensive nuclear disarmament in the final declarations on the OSCPA annual meetings just now in July in Vancouver. So there was the last meeting of the Parliamentary Assembly of the OSCE. For that reason, parliamentarians should be briefed prior to NPT prep comps and review conferences, and they should be invited to them. In general, people have to get more informed. More public discourse is needed. Why not go to schools? Inform the younger generation about possibilities like no first use of nuclear weapons. They are worried. They have heard about the humanitarian consequences and the climate risks in connection with a nuclear war.
It's something to do with the planning. Certainly, the no first use policy can be an important confidence building measure. The de facto taboo on nuclear use can reduce the probability of nuclear use. The no first use policy can also further devalue nuclear weapons as a military and political tool and contribute to the eventual elimination of nuclear weapons. I think that's quite obvious. Yes, and the biggest question is really how do we achieve no first use? I would posit that the no first use policy can be relatively easy to achieve within the confines of a nuclear balance. That's when you count nuclear weapons against nuclear weapons. So yes, that's not probably too actually difficult. The biggest challenge is that historically, the first use policy are more complex conventional military balance. Really, the roots of that policy can be found in 1950s and 60s, during the time when the United States and NATO were concerned about the Soviet conventional superiority and relied on nuclear weapons to counterbalance that superiority. Quite obviously, the first use of nuclear weapons was an integral part of that policy. But it's also not surprising that the Soviet Union that felt quite actually secure, as I would say, out in the conventional arena, adopted a no first use policy conditionally in 1970s and unconditionally in 1982. Well, I think it's quite significant though that in 1993 actually Russia once again returned to first use policy after its conventional capability was undercut by significant reductions, by the breakup of the Soviet Union, by the economic and political crisis in the country. So we can really see very, very clearly, historically, an integral kind of link between the conventional power balance and the propensity to adhere to first use. That link continued to remain valid in subsequent years. In fact, the threat of limited nuclear use to prevent conventional defeat the main rationale for the first use policy. It has been part of the official military doctrine of Russia since 2000. It continues to be one today. Well, in fact, today we see a public discourse in Russia about possible use of limited nuclear weapons against NATO in the context of war that it wages against Ukraine. Since quite significantly that the war against Ukraine is seen, in fact, Russia in Moscow as a proxy war against NATO. So when we talk about the possible nuclear use that's actively discussed right now in Russia, so yes, that would be really the use against NATO. Yes, and let me note here that I've been working in this field for 42 years, but already slightly more actually. It doesn't matter. But it's really the first time in all these years that I've seen an open debate about nuclear use of such intensity in any country, not just limited to Russia. It's not actually likely that Russia may agree to no first use in the near future. Such a step would require quite major long-term stabilization of its relationship with the West. Yes, and we do not really see that in the near future at least, but probably longer. But among the P5 countries, only China has no first use policy. Solid years ago, it continues to adhere to it. I would say the adoption of that policy was more of a political kind of gesture and everything, and I would say that based on the nuclear and conventional military balance, quite a lot of people in the world, in the United States first and foremost, do not quite believe actually the strength of that obligation. Just a declaration might not be sufficient, in fact, to make such a policy tangible. Most think that in case of conventional conflict, especially faced with defeats, China may feel that has no other choice than to resort to nuclear weapons. Yet we also know that China is increasing its military capability, both conventional and nuclear, so it probably does not have a lot of reasons to change that policy, but as its capability grows, the no first use pledge might become actually more substantial. Among the P5 countries of the United States, as well as its nuclear allies, can probably feel sufficiently secure in the conventional capability to adopt a no first use policy. So I would posit that the United States, objectively, in terms of military balance, in terms of security assessment, can adopt a no first use pledge. So the only impediment to that is, in fact, in the domestic politics. So that's something I think to work on, something to think about. Outside the P5, actually, the rationales are similar. In India, does have a no first use policy, while Pakistan, which is conventionally inferior to India, does not have it. And obviously, the North Koreans would adhere to that policy and will hardly agree to adopt it in the foreseeable future. So in the end, among the P5, the 5 official nuclear states, only Russia is likely to remain an impediment to no first use policy, well, at least in the foreseeable future. I would suggest, however, that in case the United States, United Kingdom, and France, in addition to China, well, of course, such pressure is not a guarantee that it will adopt no first use policy, but at least the likelihood will increase. So once again, something to think about along these lines in terms of the planning policy and campaigns and so on. And of course, the probability of a universal no first use policy will increase in case the international situation stabilizes and serious arms control and confidence building measures are adopted. Then the risk of great power conflict becomes lower. So, to summarize, the world has evolved a lot since the early days of the Cold War. Also, its nuclear arsenals have been significantly lowered than they used to be at the height of the Cold War, especially in the United States and Russia. Significantly, we no longer fear a large-scale nuclear war. No one really now talks about an exchange with hundreds and thousands of nuclear weapons, right? Nuclear taboo today is much stronger than it used to be like in the 60s or 70s or 80s. Yet reduction of nuclear arsenal is not a guarantee against nuclear use. But in fact, to date, the most likely scenario of nuclear use is very limited nuclear use. And we see once again debate in Russia about such a scenario. Well, of course, it's very good that the proponents out of that view are in a decisive minority in Russia, but nonetheless, that view does exist. So we can sadly conclude limited nuclear use is not completely unthinkable. And perhaps a change in declaratory policy, just a statement, of including the no first use, is not easy to achieve, and its value might actually be limited, and we might actually need to think about the material support of that and change from nuclear postures that would make no first use policy more convincing to other states. In the end, the no first use policy cannot ensure nuclear disarmament, but facilitate the achievement of that noble goal. Thank you.
Really grateful to Soka Gakkai International for all of the important work on nuclear disarmament and nuclear abolition, and highlighting here, of course, the imperative of reducing the risk of nuclear war through policies such as no first use. It's a special pleasure to speak after these esteemed panelists following their insightful remarks. So thank you for having me. I want to begin my remarks by highlighting the book, The Doomsday Machine by the late Daniel Ellsberg, a great American anti-war and anti-nuclear hero who passed away in June. Dr. Ellsberg is perhaps best known as the person who released the Pentagon Papers, which of course led to widespread public condemnation of the Vietnam War and the eventual end of the war. What is a little less well known about him was just how committed Dr. Ellsberg was to the cause of nuclear disarmament, which stemmed from his time of being not just involved in the Cuban Missile Crisis specifically, but really from having access to and participating in U.S. war planning in the late 1950s and the early 1960s. And he, at some point, sort of had these epiphanies that what was being discussed, what was being planned was just deeply insane and deeply immoral. So fairly late in life, Dr. Ellsberg wrote the book, The Doomsday Machine. And if you have not read it, you absolutely should. The book is named after a term from Stanley Kubrick's film, Dr. Strangelove. And of course, the term Doomsday Machine refers not just to the ability to harm or destroy an enemy state, but really to destroy all of humanity as we know it. And when taken in concert, our current arsenals and our current policies are simply such that the US and Russia absolutely have doomsday machines, and to a lesser extent, the other 7 countries do as well. So let me just quote Dr. Ellsberg here, and this is actually this is not from the book, this is from an interview. And he says, insane as they are unjustifiable if you really look at them critically. He's talking about the policies and the arsenals. And yet, they're treated as though they're reasonable responses to the nuclear era, which they are not. We do have to remember that deep down, when we strip away all of the terms in security and deterrence, that what we're talking about is absolutely crazy. We're talking about ending human civilization as we know it. So let me just explain what I mean by that. And then go a little bit into what we can do to dismantle. So Dr. Ellsberg also has this term, to dismantle the doomsday machine. So first and foremost, we're talking about millions of people dying from even singular attacks. If we're talking about the use of strategic nuclear weapons, we are no longer talking about Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. We're talking about bombs that are much more powerful. And of course, the deaths would not be just from the immediate impacts. They would also come from radiation. So in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we know that by the end of 1945, 230,000 people died from the attacks. The other thing is that and I know it was just mentioned that the small, what we're facing today is perhaps sort of limited nuclear exchanges as opposed to full-out nuclear war. Of course, there are 13,000 nuclear warheads in the world, and there is sort of work on simulations and understanding what are called in Washington, D.C. war games that suggest that, in fact, a single nuclear warhead exploding would not lead to restraint and would, in fact, escalate to a full-out nuclear war. And I'll just give 2 scenarios, and this pertains to work by people like Alan Robach and others on understanding nuclear winter and nuclear famine. And so if we're looking at so-called limited nuclear war between India and Pakistan, in which they use their entire arsenals, We're not talking just about 130 million deaths from the attacks themselves. We're talking about over 2 billion people dying from starvation. And I could actually tell you it's probably more like 3 billion, because those studies were based on worldwide population of 7 billion people. We have, as I hope everyone knows, we have passed 8 billion people. So that extra billion people also need food. And if there's no food in a nuclear winter, nuclear famine scenario, those deaths are just unfathomable. Again, go back to Ellsberg's words about this actually being insane. Whenever I bring up these numbers, people actually ask me, why is this acceptable? And my answer is always the same, it's not. It's not acceptable. And the question is, how do we get to a point that is in fact acceptable? So we need to dismantle the nuclear doomsday machine. That would involve has to involve dramatic reductions in arsenals. So I said something on the order of 13,000 nuclear warheads in the world today, more than 90% of that in the arsenals of the US and Russia. And so, the first reasonable thing seems to be that the US and Russia have to go from having arsenals of thousands of weapons to having arsenals of hundreds of weapons. Dr. Ellsberg thinks that even that's not enough, that what you really have to get to is the dozens, right? Because even with dozens, you could destroy a country. The United States, as we know it, could be destroyed if North Korea's arsenal is of the order of 40 nuclear warheads, let's say. United States could be destroyed. It would not be the same country if 40 nuclear warheads landed in American cities. But reducing arsenals is not enough. What else can we do? We do need confidence-building measures to get to that ultimate goal, which is zero nuclear weapons. And I'm going to say something about the level of risk in just a moment. But amongst those confidence-building measures, there could be an important role for no first use. We've heard an excellent analysis of this, so I'm not going to go into the details of who can do this and who's doing this. But other things come to mind as well. For the United States in particular, eliminating land-based missiles would be an absolutely important step. Those are sitting ducks. Those are first-use weapons only. There's no reason to have those as retaliatory weapons. And in fact, I will just add, and this was discussed yesterday in the NGO session, the ICANN statement focused on ending nuclear sharing. Of course, Russia moving its nuclear warheads to Belarus is bad news, completely not okay. But the United States has nuclear warheads in Belgium, Germany, Italy, Netherlands, and Turkey, and has had them on the European continent for decades. At one point, there were about 8,000 US nuclear warheads in Europe. Now the number is probably closer to 100. But contrary to what those governments often say about those weapons, those are all first-use weapons. And I'm quoting Dr. Ellsberg on this. There is no purpose to those weapons unless they are to be used first. So the ultimate question has to be, what level of risk, when all humanity, potentially all of life on the planet is at risk, what level of risk is acceptable? And I'm going to quote Professor Marty Hellman from Stanford University, who estimates that under the current conditions of the Ukraine war, the risk that we're dealing with, the probability of nuclear use that we're dealing with, is his estimate, and this is really high, is 1% per year. If you do a calculation on this, A child born today would have more, and we estimate their lifetime to be 80 years. A child born today would have more than a 50% chance of living or dying, living through, for some time, or dying in a nuclear war. And that is simply not acceptable. Professor Heldman, actually, I was in an email conversation with him over something else, and he told me that Dr. Bill Perry, who's the former Secretary of Defense of the United States, supports his probability estimate and agrees with it. And so, if you think that that's too high, that's okay. We can all agree it's not zero. And the question is ultimately that, to me, the only level of risk acceptable under these conditions is zero, and we need to get to zero. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons can get us there, but if in the meantime we can reduce the risk with policies such as no first use, that would certainly be more than welcome. So I'll end on that.
Thank you so much. And, could you share some of the parliamentarians have successfully worked together in your local context?
Well, in general, of course, public engagement is always a very important issue, and for civil society, because it's their country, their life, their future, and be it in the social field or be it with a voluntary fire brigade. The minimum of public engagement is to go and vote when there are elections. Very often people don't even take that. Civil society, and it's very often it's women and artists also play are key players in the situation of conflict. And I many examples coming to my mind. I think of, for example, I was speaking during the war in Yugoslavia. I was speaking to women, and they said we want to have more schools and better education instead of more prisons for young men who had been in this situation committed some criminal act. I think of women marching for peace, for example, think of Northern Ireland. Or when I think of artists, I really like the idea of Daniel Barenboim when he created the West Eastern Divan Orchestra, where musicians from Israel and Palestine were making music together. This is just one example. But just recently in my hometown, there was, so this is also civil engagement, there is an NGO which is called Erinan, Remember, and they planted a tree, a kaki tree from Nagasaki. So they have this project worldwide that you take the seed of one kaki tree that survived when the bomb was dropped, and from that seed new kaki trees are made, and they are planted in different areas. So there was this very, very nice ceremony where the whole population was involved and school was involved when this new kaki tree, a peace tree, was planted. So, and then of course you have the discussions and you start talking about it, the issues of nuclear weapons, about the humanitarian consequences, and you bring this topic into the mind of the people, and then they start reacting. So to raise awareness is something very, very, very important, I think. And so this is one example, for example, a local example, but of course giving lectures, having discussions, media, using media. There are lots of different little films that are, or I mentioned one, the Kazakh film on Where the Wind Blows, or The Wind Blew, I think it's called. Very important because people get engaged and people become aware what's going on in the world. And the same happens with the young people. They are very worried, and we really have to inform them and give them hope. I mean, it was really not such a pleasant outlook at the future, but I'm not an optimist, but I know we have to work on that. That's the only possibility really we have. What else can we do? For example, well, this is not local, but I was invited, because you mentioned Stanley Kubrick, I was invited to Berlin at the Volkstheater, and there was a play by Yael Bardana with experts. I was one of them. When I went to this big stage, I wasn't sure if I really wanted to do this, but it was very exciting, and it was like the situation was like in the Stanley Kubrick film, but the topic was, what if women ruled the world? And it was very interesting. There were the actors and the experts kind of communicating, and she made a film of it, and it's called, I think it's called, because it's 2 or 3 years ago, 2 minutes to midnight. So with the question, what if women ruled the world, what would happen? And a further engagement, for example, is we have a little conference close to the highest mountain of Austria dealing with climate change. It's an annual conference, and we try to bring in experts from philosophy to politicians and diplomats. And we talk about climate change, but of course we talk about nuclear weapons and what is a nuclear winter. To make people aware, not just to try to forget the threats that we have, and to make it a momentum again so that politics react. I think it's kind of easy in Austria, but we have to try and communicate that worldwide. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And next question, we ask you to the Ivana. There are some comments that are that misconception about no first use. It's like first use is not okay, but secondary use would be accepted, but that's not correct. And can you share more about why no first use complement disarmament rather than act as a barrier to disarmament, and the connection to bridging to the no first use to the TPNW and elimination of disarmament?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think to me, it's perhaps the we're sort of at a stalemate, right, in nuclear disarmament, where we sort of went from the peak in arsenals in 1986 to kind of a steady decline, and then over the last decade or so, not just a flat line, but perhaps even an increase. And so the work of nuclear disarmament, in some sense, needs to be restarted. And to get there, you probably do need the confidence building measures. So I do see this as an opportunity to kind of bridge the gap and get us there. I'll just talk a little bit about TPNW, in that what I find, and in particular in the United States, that there's this really a misconception that somehow you join the treaty and now you are, you have to eliminate your arsenals immediately while all of your so-called enemies keep theirs. And that's just not true at all. First and foremost, signing, any leader that decided to sign the TPNW would at that point simply signal their seriousness in addressing nuclear disarmament and seriousness in what they all say, a world free of nuclear weapons. But we have to start somewhere. So signature would just signal that. At that point, and I really do see that the ball is in the court of the United States and Russia. Those are the 5,000 plus, nearly 6,000 nuclear warhead arsenals, those arsenals have to come down. You cannot tell, in my opinion, you cannot tell North Korea, you can't have 40 while we have 6,000. Or even China, you can't have 300 or 400 while we have 6,000. You have to come down. And it seems to me reasonable, and other people have suggested this, and I sort of, came up with the number even before reading some of this literature. It seems reasonable. Even Russia can come down to 1,000. If the point of these weapons is nuclear deterrence, there's really no reason to have any more. 1,000 is plenty actually to destroy the world as we know it. So certainly plenty to destroy your enemy. That's the signal you want to send. So those two countries come down to 1,000, and then you work on everyone signing the TPNW. You work on a multilateral plan for how you're all going to get down to, and perhaps then from 1,000 they have to get down to, say, the level of China right now, and then they all have to come down together. It's only when these countries, when these states would ratify the treaty, that the obligations would begin. And even after ratification, it's already sort of, part of not just discussions, but official documents as well in the TPNW, that there would be a timetable of, say, 10 years from ratification to eliminate the weapons. So there's plenty of time, plenty of room, and I think misunderstanding that somehow committing to TPNW would now mean that you've left yourself vulnerable to nuclear attacks from other nuclear state possessors. So, but thank you for the question.
Thank you so much. And next question will to Nikolai. And you mentioned that no first use is important for confidence building, and I agree. However, there is an argument that no first use is only a pledge or just a piece of paper. And you too mentioned that only no first use is not sufficient. How can we trust that no first use is actually upheld, and how can we make it more tangible?
Be completely sure that it will be upheld, but it can increase the tangibility of no first use policy. I would say the best, the easiest way to do that is by reducing the readiness of nuclear weapons for use, so that you cannot simply press the button and something flies, right? Well, it would be the easiest probably to achieve. Let me say that we already have that for non-strategic attacks called nuclear weapons. Okay. Because all nuclear weapons with delivery vehicles are kept in storage. And it would really take time to take them out, to put them on delivery vehicles, and so on and so forth. So it's a very good thing. So we have the same for air-launched nuclear weapons. The United States and Russia, other countries, no longer actually fly aircraft with nuclear weapons, and all of these are kept in storage. So we really have now two categories of nuclear delivery vehicles, both of them strategic, that can be used on short notice. That's the land-based missiles, ICBMs. Well, it's not easy, but doable, I would say. Nuclear warheads from ICBMs, and submarine-launched ballistic missiles, or SLBMs, that might be actually more kind of challenging. I'm not saying it's impossible, I'm saying it's challenging. So in a situation where you cannot really use nuclear weapons on short notice, in my view, the tangibility of no first use pledge would be higher.
John Hallam, People for Nuclear Disarmament and Abolition 2000, and No First Use Group. I've seen a great deal of discussion of the likelihood or otherwise of nuclear war. I'm surprised that Martin still puts it as low as 1% per year. I think it is much higher than that. It's always in terms of escalation to global nuclear war. I haven't, to my memory, seen any discussion of regional, local, or sort of partial nuclear war. So this very much emphasizes Ivana's point that we are looking down the barrel of global thermonuclear war, and that the likelihood of a limited nuclear war is indeed much lower than that of global thermonuclear war. I realise that is a comment, but I do hope that you comment on my comment.
Climate and famine. When I said limited regional nuclear war, that was a specific scenario of India and Pakistan, right? So then no one else gets involved. The scenario that they simulate for a war between US and Russia is 4,400 nuclear warheads, which is approximately 1/3 of US's and Russia's arsenals. And that's truly end of human civilization as we know it. According to their numbers,
and that's the same as what I was saying.
Yeah, exactly. I guess to me, so there was some mention of, the risk right now and really Russia threatening to use a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine. No, they're not. Okay. Yeah, or it being interpreted as a threat. Let's just put it that way. An interpretation that there's a threat or the possibility that a single nuclear warhead is used in the context of the Ukraine war. And I have no idea what the likelihood is that it could end, but let's even just imagine that it ends on one nuclear warhead being used. To me, that's terrifying, not only because that one warhead would create a ton of devastation and damage and deaths, but because it would mean the breaking of the taboo. And what that would mean for what happens 5 years later or 10 years later or even 20 years later. I'm thinking of the life scale and lifetimes of my own children, and hopefully someday I have grandchildren. It's just not okay. It's not okay to say, oh yes, well we escaped it this time, but in 20 years someone else comes down the line. And the same scenario doesn't play out the same way. And so, I like to quote John F. Kennedy, we must abolish nuclear weapons before they abolish us. That's, to me, that says it all.
Because you said it's talking about local, and as I mentioned, where the wind blows, then it's not local anymore. It goes beyond the borders. When we think of Chernobyl, different countries up to the to Lapland in Finland and Sweden, they had problems. They had to kill the deers there and things like that. So it's never local. It always goes beyond the borders.
Yes, I'm afraid that I am approaching that from a more kind of practical perspective. It's less emotional perspective. It's not that I'm not emotional. I'm very much emotional. I don't like the idea of nuclear use, but in my work in all those decades, yes, I got used to separating my personal feelings was relevant analysis. Now, very few people really seriously actually think about using nuclear weapons. So everyone understands that it's extremely bad. The challenge that I see today, unlike in the Cold War, and that's why I'm talking about the limited nuclear use, is that you may try to leverage nuclear weapons to avoid conventional defeat. You leverage the possibility of using nuclear weapons to prevent the attack on you, conventional attack on you. So please note that we talk about the no first use of nuclear weapons, right? One thing I have not actually heard here is about the no use of force. So please keep in mind, the elimination of nuclear weapons is a wonderful goal. Yes, I'm very much supporting that. I've done in my life what I could. So the reductions of nuclear weapons have been very significant. Yes, and in fact, yes, I did participate in all these negotiations, and I did my contribution to that. But the question there is that we tend to forget that the Second World War, a primitive actually war at the technical level, did actually devastate Europe and cost about 50 million lives. So it's not a small number. So the fact that we might eliminate nuclear weapons does not necessarily mean that we'll avoid devastation, including civilian. The biggest actual risk that I see today is the desire to leverage the threat of nuclear weapons in a conventional conflict, but the problem is it starts on an escalation path.
Quite so.
Yes, and when you get into the escalation kind of spiral, it may be very difficult, in fact, to get out of it. You might start the escalation spiral thinking that you will not actually need to use nuclear weapons, right? But once you get sucked into it, once you come very close to the threshold, yes, it becomes very, very risky. So yes, and that's why I really say that today the biggest actual risk of nuclear use is very limited nuclear use. Of course, it can escalate further then. We also do not quite actually think about intermediate steps, such as a nuclear test, for example. To make a stronger kind of point about the threat of nuclear use, you might actually test a nuclear weapon, underground, everything. So yes, the CCTV flies out of the window, but so what? You've got a security kind of situation that you consider very serious and so on and so forth. So once again, the risk there, I think, is very, very considerable. Now, all about Ukraine, nuclear use against Ukraine. I frankly do not see the possibility of Russian nuclear use against Ukraine. No, it simply doesn't make sense. But I would see a lot of actual sense to threaten the use of nuclear weapons against a NATO country. So I'm not really saying that the possibility of nuclear use does not exist. I'm just saying that will seem a different kind of shape.
Can I respond? Is that okay? Sure. Yeah, just very briefly. I thank you so much for your insightful comments. I really do appreciate them. I just want to bring up one other angle, which is that a lot of what you're talking about is deliberate use. And I'm even, perhaps, I don't know if it's more or, similarly concerned about the possibility of use by accident or miscalculation. Well, there are dozens.
Miscalculation, yes.
And there are for the US alone, and maybe we're just that stupid, but the US has had near accidents. There are literally dozens of examples, some of them more innocuous, some of them far, far more serious. The other thing is that for the United States, for the presidents for whom we have full, disclosed, declassified materials, every single one of them has considered using nuclear weapons, including Richard Nixon while drunk in the Oval Office, and people had to convince him not to push the button, to wait till he was sober to then actually proceed with the attack. So that doesn't give, and maybe things have changed, and maybe our more recent presidents are just that much better people, but I don't know. I don't know. So those are the kinds of things that, make it, you say the 1% seems too low.
To me, 1% seems positively optimistic.
When you put 1% in the context of a child born today, to me that's just devastating, absolutely devastating.
I think it would be very helpful, because when you think of the conference of 2014, when Austria started with the humanitarian pledge, so there was just the idea to come away from the technical issues, but trying to bring it more on the ground to the population, and this was very successful. So the humanitarian pledge really led to something in the end. So now starting maybe with this statement, I think if the countries, if some countries start to do this and have some talk about that in Parliament and have a motion on it, so then other countries could start as well. And I think PND certainly is the best organization for doing so, because you have the parliamentarians everywhere in all the countries, and it's always the small steps. But at this conference, for example, 2014, parliamentarians had not been invited, so together with PND, we organized a side conference only for parliamentarians, so that they could be invited as well, otherwise they wouldn't have been able to come. So I think there is a lot we can do, and I think it's a very good idea. Thank you.
Points. My name is Sanya from SGI. I have a question, two-part question. One is around the sort of strategic policy side of things, that starting from now, looking forward, maybe no first use as a first milestone, NPT, TPNW, what happens at a point where there is a global norm of no first use? What's the framework to get from that point to actual nuclear disarmament and reparations or support for also victims? But so what is the sort of strategic pipeline of that happening? That's one. Second, in that whole process, as well as the strategic side, I think a lot of this does really come down to trust, as was mentioned. And what non-policy or non-diplomatic processes do you think are necessary to build that trust on a global scale, to actually make no first use not just a nice piece of paper, but a reality as well? So, thank you.
All right. To your first question, you can actually achieve nuclear disarmament without no first use.
Okay.
So it's not a condition, it's not a step of achieving nuclear disarmament by creating the right kind of political and strategic climate. So I would not really see it in exactly the same way as you painted. Yes, and you can have first use policy on all along until you achieve zero nuclear weapons. Yes, it's just easier to do with no first use. So yes, basically that's it.
But what does that look like? Like, how does one lead to the other?
No, one does not necessarily lead to the other. You need to improve the overall international situation, the climate, the perceptions. Here I must note what you're asking about, how you strengthen the pledge. I would say that words and statements do actually matter. They might be not as strong as a legally binding treaty, for example, or a verifiable treaty and so forth. But nonetheless, including from my own experience, such statements do matter. It's worth recalling that the category of nuclear weapons that saw the most radical decrease was tactical nuclear weapons. And this was done without any treaty. It was done out on the force of two unilateral declarations by the United States and the Soviet Union, subsequently confirmed by Russia. On the Russian side, the reduction was from about 21,000 weapons to estimated actually below 2,000 today. Well, 2,000 or 1,700, well, it's still too many, all right, yes, I agree. But nonetheless, just look at the scale. Also, as it was done, I would not really discount the influence of statements or policies and so on and so forth.
So I just want to emphasize the role of civil society and also the international community. So to me, what took place in the 1980s was really just a widespread civil society and just general population concern about where things were going with the nuclear arms race, and in particular in the United States. In 1982, a million people marched. I live in New York City, and I walk through Central Park every so often and just try to imagine a million people marching today, right, against nuclear weapons. It's difficult to imagine, but they did it. They pulled it off 40 years ago. And what I think is really important to recognize is when in places like the United States, where we have the ability to speak up in this way, when the general population speaks, it speaks to the entire world. It doesn't just speak to the US government. And in the case of the 1982 march, a man named Mikhail Gorbachev was a young Russian leader who was watching and paying attention. And so these are important messages that we can send out into the world. I also do see the sort of the road ahead towards nuclear abolition, towards that ultimate goal of nuclear zero, as one involving pressure from both inside, so inside the countries that have nuclear weapons, we need more civic engagement, and I see it as coming from the outside, from the wonderful international community of countries, as we all know, primarily led by the Global South, but wonderful leaders throughout, including, of course, Austria, where we are today. And I think that kind of double pressure from the inside and the outside is really what we need to get to where we need to get to. So thank you.
Just underline, civil society is very, very important, and we have to create this atmosphere again that people think about, are aware of the threats of nuclear weapons. And I think this is possible. Think of the young people and their demands on working or doing more for combating climate change. Climate change is an issue. Everybody talks about climate change now. So we have to combine that. We have to tell the people we are afraid of nuclear weapons. It's a danger to civil society. And what I usually also like to mention is how much they cost. So one thing we did was with BNND also counting the nuclear money. I've got the figures here. So it's like there is about over $1 trillion is being spent to modernize the nuclear arsenals of 9 countries in the next years. So do you know $1 trillion? It's the figure with 12 zeros. 12 zeros. It's if you spend $1,000 a day, you need 2,700,000 years to spend it. And if you spend $1,000 every second, you will need little over 31 years to completely spend it. So what we did was we tried to thank you. We tried to count every second $1,000. It's almost not impossible. And this is something what society really understands. And what we did was, what would you use this money for if you could? What about poverty? What about education? What about the health systems? And I understand you have to separate your the professional side and the emotional side. I don't have to do this. I can put on the emotional side. I want to get the civil society to go with us and put pressure on the parliaments, put pressure on the governments, and create something that we march for the abolition of nuclear weapons.
It's really a very, very short note here. Please note that conventional action modernization and conventional forces do generally cost more than even nuclear forces, especially now extremely high tech. So talk here about broader kind of scene, because once again, elimination of nuclear weapons itself will not really eliminate war and will not eliminate poverty. So,
you're right, yes. But
I'm sorry about that.
Can I
Oh, yes.
from her? I think so that will be the last question.
Thank you. So everybody want to be stronger, and so it's some kind of circle, and you mentioned the civil society with parliamentarian, or also would it be more possible to put more women on the table of negotiations, or what is your experience or opinion about this trust building among nations? Thank you.
yes, I agree. Women, women at the table. We have this UN resolution 1325. Yes, and it's very difficult. It's very difficult in this time of aggression and mistrust how to start. You know, one little thing, when I was president of the Parliamentary Assembly, I asked there were the leaders of the groups of parliamentarians of Azerbaijan and Armenia, where women happened to be women, so I asked them for a coffee. I wanted to have a coffee with them, so they couldn't say no to the president. So we went for a coffee, and we took the lady of Georgia with us. And first, they didn't talk. But then I said, I just wanted to talk with you about the shoes you bought, about the beautiful mountains and the weather. And so we started something to talk. They had to laugh. And then, after that, after a while, we started to talk about female issues, what are the obstacles for a woman to become a politician in their countries. And out of that, there was a kind of confidence that was established. And when we went back to the conference itself, it showed that they said, well, we are not going to talk to each other as we did, but we try to talk on issues in a correct form, at least. So there was a change of atmosphere, and then of course you have to go on that. You have to take every little issue where you can find the possibilities to build trust. And I think it's very sad now in this conflict that even scientists from universities don't or are not allowed or are afraid to talk to each other out, even if they are not in the war. I mean, their countries are in the war, but not the scientists. So why not encourage groups to keep on talking to each other. I think this is very, very important. And I really think women play an important role because they sometimes try to do it another way, just on very practical issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we're a bit proud of the majority of the panelists is women today. Thank you so much. And I'd really like to continue this discussion more, but now time is up. So now I'd like to conclude the Q&A. And I'd like to thank you, our co-organizer, Nuclear Peace Foundation and the PND for your support. And thank you once again to the panelists and all the participants for your cooperation. Thank you so much.